An ordinary farmer was plowing his field when he noticed an old rusty chain sticking out of the ground. Pulling on it, he dug up something that changed his life forever. His discovery shocked not only his neighbors, but everyone. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories, and write in the comments which city you're from. The sun was already up by the time Harold Johnson pulled on his boots and stepped out onto the porch of his farmhouse. The air carried with it the scent of dust and the faint promise of heat, the kind that pressed down on the earth and on a man's shoulders alike. Before him stretched acres of land, some patches lush with struggling rows of corn, others dry and stubborn, resisting every attempt to coax life from them. The barn sagged a little more each season. Its red paint faded to a weathered brown, and the tractor parked near the shed carried scars of age, its engine coughing more often than it roared. Yet Harold stood there as he did every morning, surveying what was both his burden and his inheritance. He had been born into this land. His father before him had worked it with hands hardened like leather, and his grandfather had broken the soil long before Harold had even understood the meaning of labor. When Harold was a boy, the earth had seemed endless, a playground of open fields where he could run behind his father, watching him wrestle the plow or tend to the animals. He could still remember his mother's voice calling them in for supper, her meals made from whatever the farm had given that day. Those memories were warm, filled with laughter and the simple pride of a family surviving together. But those days had faded into a kind of sepia tone in Harold's mind, reminders of what had been and what seemed to slip farther away with every passing year. Now, middle-aged and alone, Harold carried the weight of those generations on his back. His wife, Cynthia, had passed away from illness years ago, leaving him with silence where her laughter once filled the house. His 2 sons had long since left for the city, chasing lives that had nothing to do with fields and barns. They had told him the truth plainly. Farming was a dead end, too hard for too little reward. Harold had nodded, even agreed in part, but deep inside he had never been able to abandon what his father had entrusted to him. This farm was more than soil and fences. It was a memory, a chain linking him to those who had come before. Even as the debts mounted and the harvest dwindled, he had refused to let it go. Yet there were nights when he sat alone at the kitchen table with the ledger open, the numbers glaring back at him like silent accusations. The bills for seed and fertilizer, the electricity, the repairs for the tractor, they piled up faster than the harvest brought in. He had taken loans he knew he might never repay. The bank's letters grew sterner, the deadlines tighter. He told himself he had to hold on, had to push through one more season. But the truth lingered in his heart. The farm was slipping from his grasp. Despite the struggle, every morning he rose before dawn. He walked the fields with the same determination his father had once carried, though now there was more weariness in his step. He leaned down to touch the soil, feeling its dryness, searching for some sign that it might still yield enough to keep him afloat. Sometimes, as he stood there alone, he wondered who he was doing this for. His sons would not return. The community did not depend on his crops. He was a solitary figure clinging to the past, carrying a legacy that seemed heavier than ever. In town, Harold was known as the quiet farmer who kept to himself. The community was small, tight-knit, and predominantly white. While no one treated him with outright hostility, he had always sensed a kind of distance, as though he were tolerated but never embraced. The men at the feed store greeted him with nods but rarely lingered to talk. At the diner, he often sat at a corner booth, eating in silence while groups of others laughed together. It wasn't open rejection, but it was enough to remind him that he was different, a man apart. He had lived with that sense of separation all his life, accepting it the way one accepts the change in seasons, something unchangeable, part of the landscape itself. Still, there were those who respected him. People knew Harold as a hard worker, a man who paid what he owed when he could, who helped a neighbor mend a fence without being asked. Yet the respect was distant, never translating into true kinship. The farm kept him isolated, and Harold had grown used to filling his own silence with the hum of machinery or the whisper of wind through the crops. One particular evening, after a long day spent trying to coax life out of the far field, Harold sat on the porch with a glass of water in his hand, staring out at the horizon. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The earth beneath his boots looked tired, cracked in places where the rain had refused to fall. He thought of his father then, how the old man had walked these same fields, and how he had always said the land carried memory. "This ground remembers, son," his father used to tell him, "and it'll remember you, too, if you take care of it." Those words rang in Harold's ears, but now they felt heavier, almost haunting. What if all the ground remembered was his failure? His hands, calloused and rough, tightened around the glass. The truth was, he was close to losing everything. The debt collector's call earlier that week had been curt and final. One more missed payment and the bank would start proceedings. Harold felt trapped, cornered by fate and circumstance. He had thought about selling, about walking away, but the very idea twisted in his chest. How could he abandon the land that had been in his family for 3 generations? How could he let go of the only thing that tied him to his father's memory? As darkness fell over the fields, Harold stood and walked out a few paces, feeling the soil crunch beneath his boots. He crouched down, scooping a handful of dirt into his palm. He let it sift through his fingers, watching the small grains fall back to the ground. There was something about the earth itself, something that spoke of endurance and hidden stories. He didn't know why, but in that moment he felt as if the land was holding back a secret, waiting for the right time to reveal it. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as nonsense born of fatigue, and turned back toward the house. That night, as he lay in bed, the old farmhouse creaked with familiar sounds, the wind slipping through cracks, the distant hoot of an owl. He stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, his mind circling the same questions. How much longer could he keep going? What would become of the farm if he lost it? The weight of legacy pressed on him like an invisible yoke, binding him to a past he could not abandon, yet dragging him toward a future he dreaded. The next morning would bring more labor, more battles with stubborn machinery and unyielding soil. But Harold didn't yet know that soon, buried beneath that very soil, lay something that would change the course of his life and transform the meaning of the land he had fought so hard to hold on to. The following morning dawned heavy with heat, the kind of morning when the sky already shimmered with pale brightness and the air clung damply to the skin. Harold rose early, as he always did, his body moving through the familiar rhythm of habit, even though his thoughts still felt weighted from the restless night before. He had lingered too long over the numbers in his ledger, over the unspoken question of how much longer the farm could be his, but daylight pushed those worries to the back of his mind. There was work to do, and worry did not plant or harvest crops. He ate quickly, barely tasting the toast and coffee, and pulled on his hat before stepping out to the yard. The tractor stood waiting near the old shed, its metal dull and streaked with rust, but dependable enough to keep him working. He climbed into the seat, adjusted himself with the weary motion of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, and coaxed the engine to life. It groaned and coughed before settling into a steady rhythm, and Harold guided it toward the far end of the property, to a section of ground that had not been tilled in years. His father had left it untouched, perhaps thinking it too poor to yield anything, perhaps simply saving it for later. To Harold, it was wasted earth, and he needed every inch he could cultivate. The field stretched before him, uneven and dry, patches of grass poking through where once there had been crops. Harold lowered the plow and began to cut through the soil, watching the earth turn over in neat, dark rows behind him. Dust rose in a low cloud, clinging to his clothes and face, but he hardly noticed. His mind was focused, his hands steady on the wheel. For a time, the rhythm of the machine dulled his thoughts, and he lost himself in the simple act of moving forward, row after row. Then the tractor jolted suddenly, lurching as though it had struck a buried stone. Harold braced himself, pulling the throttle back as the machine shuddered to a stop. He cursed under his breath, thinking of the damage a hidden boulder could do to the plow. Shutting off the engine, he climbed down, wiping sweat from his brow as he squinted into the harsh sunlight. The soil was freshly turned, a long scar of dark earth against the pale grass, and in the middle of that scar something caught the light. At first it looked like nothing more than a shard of rusted metal. Harold bent down, brushing away the dirt with the edge of his boot, and saw a curved, pitted surface. Frowning, he crouched and reached into the soil. His fingers closed around something rough, iron cold despite the heat of the morning. He tugged lightly and felt resistance, the object giving only slightly before refusing to move. As he cleared more of the dirt away, he saw it for what it was, a length of chain, its links thick and crusted with rust, disappearing into the earth. He sat back on his heels, frowning at the strange sight. A chain buried deep in a fallow field was no common thing. His first thought was that it might have been part of some old farm equipment, discarded and forgotten. But as he pulled at it again, the links did not budge, as though something heavy held it fast below the surface. His curiosity stirred despite himself. He could have ignored it, marked the spot, and returned later. Yet there was something in the way the chain gleamed faintly through the dust and the stubbornness with which it clung to the earth that compelled him to keep digging. He retrieved a spade from the tractor and began to dig around the spot, loosening the soil, uncovering more of the chain. Link after link emerged, each one fused with rust and dirt, stretching deeper than he expected. He followed it patiently, sweat soaking his shirt, the sun climbing higher overhead. The more he revealed, the less it seemed like a stray piece of equipment, and the more it felt like part of something deliberate, something placed there long ago. After what felt like an hour, his spade struck wood with a dull thud. Harold froze, staring at the patch of earth where the sound had come from. He knelt and brushed at the dirt with his hands, revealing the edge of a wooden surface. The wood was dark, softened by age, its grain swollen from decades beneath the soil. Slowly, cautiously, he cleared more of it, uncovering a corner, then an edge. It was a box of some kind, a chest perhaps, reinforced with iron bands that had corroded into jagged orange streaks. The chain disappeared into a metal ring fixed to the top, as though it had been used to secure or drag it. Harold sat back, breathing hard, staring at the thing half buried before him. His first thought was practical. Maybe it was nothing more than an old tool chest left behind by his grandfather, or some forgotten store of scrap. Yet, something about the weight of the chain, the iron bands, and the way the box seemed deliberately hidden beneath the earth unsettled him. He ran his hand across the rough surface, feeling the brittle wood flake beneath his touch. The box was old, far older than anything he had ever seen on the farm. He hesitated only a moment longer before prying at the lid with the spade. The wood gave reluctantly, breaking apart in splinters until at last the top cracked open. Harold leaned closer, peering inside. At first, he saw only shadows, clumps of dirt and debris. Then, as his eyes adjusted, the shapes began to emerge. Iron cuffs, their circular bands unmistakable even in ruin, lay twisted together in a heap. Chains smaller than the one that had led him here coiled among them, their links fused by rust. A strip of cloth, discolored and fragile, clung to the corner of the box. Beneath it, wrapped tightly in what had once been oiled paper, were bundles of folded documents. For a long moment, Harold could not move. His breath caught in his chest, and he felt the heat of the sun pressing harder, as though the world itself had gone still. He reached in with trembling hands and lifted one of the cuffs. It was heavier than he expected, the iron cold and unyielding, its inner surface still shaped to close around a wrist or ankle. He dropped it back into the box, the metallic clank echoing in his ears, and sat back in the dirt. It was no tool chest. Whatever lay before him had nothing to do with farming or the life he had known. These were the remnants of another time, a darker one, a past buried as deliberately as the chest itself. Harold stared at it, his heart thudding with confusion and dread. He did not yet understand the full meaning of what he had unearthed, but deep down he felt it. The land had yielded not just soil, but a secret that had waited generations to come to light. The sun blazed overhead, the fields stretched out around him, and Harold sat alone in the dirt beside the broken chest, staring into the fragments of history that had just altered the course of his life. He did not yet know what to do with them, nor how deeply they would reach into his own existence. But he knew with certainty that nothing on this farm, and nothing in his life, would ever feel quite the same again. When Harold carried the wooden box back to the farmhouse that evening, his arms ached and his back throbbed from hours of digging, but he barely noticed the strain. His mind was too restless, circling endlessly around the images of what he had seen in the soil. The tractor sat idle where he had left it, the row half finished, but Harold could not bring himself to climb back aboard. The thought of plowing more ground felt trivial, even absurd compared to what he had unearthed. He set the box down on the kitchen table with a grunt, dust rising from the brittle wood, and pulled off his gloves. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at it, as though the chest itself might move or breathe. The kitchen was dim, the single bulb casting a yellowish glow over the room. Harold pulled up a chair and sat heavily, then reached for the iron cuffs he had seen earlier. They were still heavy, still cold, their weight foreign in his hands. He turned one over, studying the shape, the rough edges, the ring where another chain must have been attached. He imagined, unwillingly, what it might have felt like to have that iron close around living flesh. The thought made his stomach knot. He set it aside quickly, as if it had burned him, and turned to the bundles of paper still wrapped in the cracked remains of oiled cloth. With careful fingers, he began to unwrap them. The paper was fragile, edges fraying, the ink faded to brown, but the writing was still legible. Names filled the page, written in neat cursive, each followed by numbers and notes. Some names were crossed out, others had remarks beside them. Sold, transferred, escaped. Harold blinked at the words, hardly able to believe what he was reading. He moved on to another bundle and found more of the same, lists of human beings reduced to inventory, treated as commodities. His breath came slow and shallow as he leaned closer, the room silent except for the rustle of paper. Then he found something different. A folded letter, edges torn but mostly intact, written in a hurried hand. The words spoke of fear, of men searching the countryside, of people hiding from hounds and patrols. There was mention of routes north, of secret places where food and shelter could be found. The letter was unsigned, but Harold felt a chill as he realized what it might mean. The land he worked, the soil beneath his boots every day, had not only carried crops, but had once hidden the footsteps of those who sought freedom. His farm, his inheritance, was a silent witness to lives lived and lost under chains. Harold leaned back in his chair, the papers spread before him, his heart pounding as the enormity of it settled in. The farm had always felt heavy, but now that weight had a new dimension. It was no longer just the burden of debt or the expectation of family legacy. It was history itself, pressing up from the ground, demanding to be remembered. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to steady himself. He had not asked for this. He had not been prepared to carry it. Yet here it was, undeniable, resting in his kitchen as though it had chosen him. As the night wore on, Harold found himself returning again and again to the documents, reading until the words blurred together. He thought of his father, who had walked these fields without ever mentioning such a past. Had he known? Had his grandfather known? Or had the secret been buried so deeply that it had escaped memory until now? The uncertainty gnawed at Harold, making him feel both connected and alienated from the men who had come before him. He wanted to ask them questions, but the only answers lay in the rusted metal and yellowed paper in front of him. Sleep did not come easily that night. Harold lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house, the distant chorus of crickets outside. His mind replayed the lists of names, the blunt notes beside them, the imagined faces of those who had worn the cuffs now sitting on his table. He felt the weight of injustice in his chest, a sorrow that belonged to the past but pressed heavily on the present. By morning, his decision was made. He could not keep this to himself. After feeding the animals and walking the fields with a mind distracted, Harold returned to the house and picked up his phone. His fingers hesitated over the numbers, but he finally dialed the one man he thought might understand, the professor at the nearby university, an historian he had once met at a community meeting. The man had spoken passionately about preserving the memory of those who had been enslaved, about the importance of truth in history. Harold had admired his words, but never expected to have a reason to call him. The professor answered on the third ring, his voice sharp but friendly. Harold introduced himself, then faltered, unsure how to begin. Finally, he said it plainly. He had found something on his land, something old, something that looked like shackles and papers from the time of slavery. There was a long silence on the other end, followed by cautious questions. Where had he found it? What did it look like? Was he certain? Harold described it as best he could, his voice low and steady, though inside he felt unsettled. The professor asked if he might come see it for himself. Harold agreed, naming a day and time, and when the call ended, he felt both relief and dread. For the rest of the day, he found himself drawn back to the box again and again. He could not leave it alone. Each time he lifted the lid, the sight of the objects inside struck him anew. They were not just artifacts, they were voices, silent but insistent, from a time that many would rather forget. He thought of the fields outside, the soil that had hidden this box for so long, and it seemed to him that the land itself had chosen now to speak. That evening, as the sun sank over the horizon, Harold walked slowly across the field where he had made the discovery. The earth was scarred where he had dug, the furrows broken and uneven. He stood there for a long time, staring at the disturbed ground, trying to imagine the lives connected to it. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it a weight of memory he could not shake. By the time he returned to the house, the kitchen light glowing warmly in the dusk, Harold understood that his farm would never again be just a farm. It had become something more, a place where history had surfaced, demanding recognition. He did not yet know what the professor would say, nor what others might make of it, but he knew his life had crossed a threshold. The burden of legacy had changed shape, no longer only about family or survival, but about truth, memory, and the silent voices waiting to be heard. The day the professor came to Harold's farm began, like so many others, with the air already heavy and damp before the sun had fully risen. Harold had barely slept, pacing the house through the night, glancing every so often at the wooden box that remained on the kitchen table as though it might vanish if he looked away too long. The objects inside had not changed, but his perception of them had deepened with every passing hour. They were no longer just relics. They had become a burden of truth that he could not set down. When the sound of a car crunching along the gravel drive reached his ears, Harold stepped outside, wiping his palms on his jeans. The professor emerged, a man of slight build with glasses perched on the end of his nose, his jacket wrinkled from travel. He greeted Harold warmly, but with an eagerness that betrayed his excitement. Inside the kitchen, when Harold removed the lid of the box and gestured to its contents, the professor froze, his eyes widening behind the lenses. He bent close, running careful fingers over the rusted shackles and fragile papers, his breath catching with quiet exclamations. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, half to himself. He lifted a document delicately, as though it might dissolve at his touch. His questions came quickly, about where Harold had found the chest, how deep it had been, what the soil had been like. Harold answered as best he could, his voice steady, though he felt a growing unease at the professor's intensity. It was as though the box had transformed in that moment, no longer belonging to Harold alone, but claimed by history itself. The professor stayed for hours, photographing, taking notes, speaking into a recorder with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred sites. When he finally left, promising to return with colleagues, Harold felt both relief and dread. He knew then that the quiet life he had clung to was gone. What had been private had become public, and what had been silent would soon be spoken aloud for all to hear. Within days, the professor returned, this time with 2 other historians. They walked the field where Harold had dug, their shoes sinking into the uneven soil, their faces alight with discovery. They spoke in low voices about the Underground Railroad, about secret routes and hidden shelters, about the possibility that Harold's land had been part of that network. Harold listened, his arms folded across his chest, feeling as though they spoke of a stranger's farm rather than his own. Yet, when they looked at him with gratitude, thanking him for preserving such a site by accident, he felt a flicker of pride beneath the weight of uncertainty. News traveled quickly. First, it was a local newspaper, sending a young journalist with a notepad and camera. Then, it was a regional station, arriving with microphones and bright lights that made Harold squint. Each time he was asked to tell the story of the discovery, he stumbled over his words, uncomfortable with the attention. He had never sought the spotlight, never imagined himself the subject of headlines. He was a farmer, not a spokesman, but the world insisted on casting him otherwise. The photographs of the rusted shackles and faded documents appeared in print. The words "historic find" splashed across pages and screens. Soon, cars began to appear at the end of his drive, some carrying reporters, others carrying strangers who simply wished to see the place for themselves. Harold watched as people stepped onto his land with reverence, some kneeling to touch the soil, others standing with tears in their eyes. He kept his distance, unsure how to navigate this new reality, yet moved by the emotions etched on their faces. It was not only the curious who came. Activists from nearby cities arrived, carrying banners and flowers, speaking of remembrance and justice. They gathered near the field, singing hymns that carried on the wind, their voices blending with the hum of insects and the rustle of crops. One elderly woman pressed Harold's hands between her own, thanking him with trembling words for bringing hidden truths to light. He wanted to tell her that he had done nothing, that the earth itself had chosen to reveal its secret, but the gratitude in her eyes silenced him. As the days passed, the stream of visitors grew. Cars lined the road, strangers walking his fields as though they had a right to them. Harold found himself uneasy. His once quiet farm transformed into a place of gathering. The animals grew restless at the constant activity, and Harold himself longed for silence that no longer seemed possible. At night, he sat on the porch, listening to the echoes of voices still lingering in the air, and wondered what his father would think of all this. Would he have welcomed the truth, or resented the intrusion? Harold did not know. The town, too, began to take notice. Some praised him, saying he had uncovered a treasure of history that would put their small community on the map. Others muttered about the trouble it would bring, about outsiders stirring up old wounds that were better left untouched. Harold heard whispers in the feed store, saw sidelong glances at the diner. He felt the division in the air, sharp as a blade. Yet, despite the unease, he could not deny the resonance that had begun to hum through his life. The shackles, the documents, the letters, they had awakened something not only in the community, but in himself. The land he had thought of only as a burden had revealed a deeper meaning, a story of suffering and survival that connected him to a lineage far greater than his own. He began to see the fields differently, no longer just rows of crops, but a canvas upon which history had been written in invisible ink. Late one evening, after another day of visitors, Harold walked alone to the place where the box had been buried. The soil was disturbed, marked by footprints, but the air was quiet. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring at the ground, and felt a swell of emotion he could not name. Pride, sorrow, fear, all tangled together. The earth had spoken, and now it seemed everyone else wanted to listen. Whether he was ready or not, Harold understood that he had become the keeper of a story larger than himself. When he returned to the house, the kitchen table still held the box, though now its contents had been catalogued, photographed, and in part removed for safekeeping. The space felt emptier without them, yet the weight of their presence lingered. Harold sat down heavily, resting his elbows on the wood, and stared at the empty space where the papers had been. His life had shifted, his farm transformed, and though he did not yet know where the path would lead, he felt its pull as surely as he felt the gravity of the soil beneath his boots. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Harold had ever known. What had once been a quiet, isolated farmstead now seemed to exist under a spotlight that grew brighter with each passing day. The wooden chest and its contents had been carefully transported to the university for preservation, but the story they carried remained tethered to his land and to him. Cars still came down the gravel road, some bringing families who wanted to stand on the soil where history had surfaced, others bringing activists who carried placards and spoke about justice long deferred, and still others carrying reporters who wanted fresh angles and dramatic sound bites. Harold, who had always lived in the margins of public life, suddenly found himself placed squarely at its center. At first, he endured it with a kind of stoic patience, watching from his porch as strangers trespassed across his fields, their voices carried on the wind like an intrusion into his solitude. But patience quickly gave way to unease. The cows grew skittish with the constant influx of people. His chores were disrupted by knocking on his door, and his once familiar routines crumbled. He longed for the days when his greatest worry was whether the tractor would start. Now he was burdened with questions he had never wanted to ask, let alone answer, about history, about responsibility, about whether he had a duty greater than tending the earth. The community around him began to fracture. At the diner, men who had once given him polite nods now avoided his eyes or muttered as he walked past. He overheard snatches of conversation that stung with resentment. He should have left it buried. All this talk's just going to stir trouble. Why let outsiders come in and turn our town into some kind of museum of shame? The words clung to him, heavy and bitter. Harold was not a man who sought conflict, but he could feel it pressing in on him from all sides. There were, of course, voices of support. Church groups spoke of his courage, young students came out to hear him tell the story of the discovery, and families who traced their ancestry back to those who had been enslaved thanked him with tears in their eyes. Yet the balance between gratitude and hostility left Harold uneasy. For every person who thanked him, there was another who glared as though he had betrayed something sacred by bringing the past into the light. One evening, as he returned from town with a sack of feed in the back of his truck, he found a scrap of paper tucked under the wiper blade. The handwriting was jagged, scrawled in anger. "Stop before it's too late." He held it in his hand for a long time, the setting sun throwing long shadows across the yard. Fear twisted in his stomach, but anger soon followed. He had not asked for any of this. He had not sought to make himself a symbol or to turn his farm into a gathering place. All he had done was plow his land, and the earth itself had decided to speak. The pressure grew heavier when the historians returned, this time accompanied by representatives of the state. They spoke in smooth, official tones about preservation, about the possibility of declaring his farm a historical site, about grants and funding and opportunities. They offered figures that made Harold's head spin, numbers large enough to pay off his debts and more besides. The catch, though unspoken, was clear. The land would no longer be his in the same way. What had once been fields for planting and harvesting would become ground for memorials and exhibits. His farm would cease to be a farm, and Harold would cease to be only a farmer. At night, he sat at the kitchen table with the documents they had left behind, proposals filled with promises. His hands, rough and calloused, left smudges on the clean white pages. He tried to picture himself agreeing, tried to imagine walking away from the only life he had known. The thought of giving up the land felt like losing his father all over again, like severing the last tie to the man who had taught him to work the soil. Yet he could not deny the truth that his farm was no longer just his own. It belonged, in some sense, to history itself, to a story larger than him, and to a people whose voices had been silenced for too long. The conflict outside his walls grew sharper. Strangers knocked late at night, demanding to speak to him, some with anger in their voices, others with desperation. He found a spray-painted message on his fence one morning, a crude slur that left him standing in the dawn light with his fists clenched and his heart heavy. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the very air around him had turned hostile. Yet, in the same week, a group of children from the city came on a school bus, carrying flowers and singing as they walked into his fields. He watched from a distance, something in his chest tightening as he saw them kneel in the soil and press their palms to the earth. The push and pull tore at him. Some days he felt pride, believing that perhaps his life had been given a new purpose. Other days he longed to turn the clock back, to cover the chest with dirt once more and pretend he had never seen it. The farm had once been a place of hardship, yes, but also of order, of routines that anchored him. Now it felt like shifting ground beneath his feet, and he was unsure if he could stand on it much longer. The professors and activists returned often, each time with more urgency. They spoke of opportunity, of legacy, of the moral imperative to preserve the site for generations to come. Their words were passionate, but Harold could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. It was as though they had decided who he must be, without asking if he had the strength to be that man. The money they promised tempted him, for it meant relief from the crushing burden of debt, but it also meant surrendering the life he had fought to hold on to. As the nights grew longer and colder, Harold walked his fields alone, his boots crunching on the hard soil. The sky stretched wide above him, stars scattered like salt across black velvet, and he thought of his father's voice telling him that the land remembers. He wondered now what it remembered of him. Was he a farmer clinging stubbornly to a failing legacy, or was he something else, something chosen by the earth to bear witness to truths long buried? The conflict raged inside him, louder than the whispers of neighbors or the chants of activists. It was the battle between past and present, between the man he had always been and the man the world now seemed to demand he become. The pressure grew heavier each day, pressing against him from within and without, until it felt as though the very air he breathed carried the weight of choice. And though he had not yet spoken it aloud, Harold knew that soon he would have to decide. The cold of late autumn had settled over the farm, and Harold felt it in his bones each morning when he pulled on his coat and stepped into the brittle air. The fields lay mostly bare now, the last of the harvest brought in, but he could not shake the feeling that something unfinished lingered in the soil. He had walked those acres his whole life, seen them in every season, yet never had they seemed so full of questions. The discovery had changed not only what others saw in his land, but what he saw in it himself. Every furrow, every stretch of field felt haunted by the memory of what had been buried there, and though the chest was gone, carried off by historians for preservation, its absence weighed on him as heavily as its presence once had. The conflict that had consumed the past weeks had left Harold weary. He had grown used to visitors in their suits and coats, their polished shoes unsuited for mud, their voices full of persuasion and promise. They came with papers and figures, with contracts and plans for the future. They spoke of the importance of honoring the past, of creating a place where people could come to learn and remember. They told him he would be part of something larger than himself, that he had been chosen by chance but could now embrace it as destiny. Their words filled the kitchen, spilled into the living room, followed him onto the porch. He nodded politely, listened in silence, but inside he felt torn apart. Each night he carried their words with him out into the fields. The cold air stung his lungs, the stars sharp and brilliant overhead. He walked along the rows, his boots crunching on frozen soil, and thought of his father. He could still see the old man in his mind's eye, tall and broad-shouldered, leaning on a hoe, his face lined with years of labor. His father had loved this land, not for wealth or glory, but because it was theirs, hard won and hard kept. He had taught Harold that the land remembers, that it carries the lives of those who walk it. Now, Harold wondered if his father had ever guessed what else the soil held. Would he have wanted it revealed, or would he have told Harold to leave the past where it lay? The pressure from the outside world only grew. One morning, a group of activists arrived unannounced, carrying banners with words painted in bold black letters. They sang and prayed at the edge of his field, their voices lifting into the crisp air. Harold watched from a distance, his heart tight. Their devotion moved him, yet he also felt overwhelmed. They saw him as a symbol, a man standing at the center of justice and memory, when, in truth, he felt like a farmer drowning in forces far beyond his control. That same afternoon, a man from the state returned with a folder of official documents. He laid them out on Harold's table, explaining in measured tones that the government was prepared to purchase part of his land, to establish a memorial and educational site. The offer was generous, far more money than Harold had ever imagined holding in his hands. It would erase his debts, secure his future, and free him from the constant struggle that had defined his life. Yet the cost was clear. The land would no longer be his in the same way. The fields where he had toiled beside his father, the soil he had turned year after year, would belong to others. After the man left, Harold sat for hours at the kitchen table, staring at the papers. His hands trembled as he touched them, not from fear of signing, but from the enormity of what it meant. He imagined selling the land, imagined waking one morning and realizing he was no longer a farmer, but a caretaker of history. He tried to picture himself without the weight of plowing and planting, without the rhythm of harvest and the anxiety of weather. The image was strange, foreign, like trying to imagine his life in another man's clothes. As darkness fell, Harold lit the old lamp in the living room and sat in his father's chair. He closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him. He saw himself as a boy, following his father across the fields, stumbling to keep up. He heard his father's voice, stern but full of love, telling him that the land was more than earth, that it was life itself. He thought of his mother, her hands roughened by work but gentle as she smoothed his hair, her laughter carrying through the kitchen. He thought of his sons, their faces young and eager as they once ran through the same fields before life pulled them away to distant cities. The land had carried all of it, had been the backdrop for every joy and sorrow of his life. To let it go felt like cutting out a piece of himself. Yet, when he closed his eyes, he also saw the iron cuffs, the names on the faded list, the desperate words of the letter. He saw the faces of those who had come to his farm in recent weeks, the tears in their eyes as they pressed their hands to the soil. He heard their voices thanking him, not for farming the land, but for bringing forth its truth. And he felt something stir inside him, something stronger than fear or reluctance. Perhaps his purpose was not to cling to the land as a farmer, but to let it become what it was always meant to be, a place of remembrance. That night, Harold walked out once more into the cold fields. The moon was high, silver light spilling over the rows of bare soil. He stood where the chest had been unearthed, the ground still uneven, and let the silence surround him. He spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the land itself, to the memory of his father, to the ghosts of those who had passed unseen. "If this is what you want," he whispered, "then I will do it." His breath hung in the air, a fragile cloud, before disappearing into the night. When he returned to the house, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The choice was no longer a question, but a certainty. He would agree to the sale, would allow the land to become a memorial. It was not the end of his legacy, but its transformation. He would no longer be only the son of a farmer. He would be the keeper of a story larger than himself, a witness to truths that demanded to be remembered. In the morning, when the first light touched the horizon, Harold sat at the kitchen table once more. The papers lay before him, waiting. His hand was steady as he picked up the pen. For a moment, he paused, feeling the gravity of what he was about to do. Then he signed his name. The sound of the pen scratching across the page was quiet, but in his heart it echoed like a bell, marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. He sat back and let out a long breath. The farm was still his for now, but soon it would belong to memory and history. He felt sorrow, yes, but also a sense of release. For the first time in years, he was no longer haunted by the fear of losing everything. Instead, he had chosen what to give, and in that choice he found a strength he had not known he possessed. The decision was made, and with it, Harold felt the weight of the land shift. It was no longer only a burden, but a gift, one that he could offer to those who needed it most. As the morning light spread across the fields, he rose from the table and stepped outside, breathing in the cold air with new resolve. The farm would no longer define him as it once had, but it would continue to speak, and through it, so would he. Winter passed slowly across the farm, and for the first time in years, Harold did not greet the changing season with dread. The fields lay bare beneath a crust of frost. The barns echoed with quiet rather than the clamor of harvest, and the animals seemed fewer and less restless, as though they too sensed that life was shifting. The decision had been made, the papers signed, and though the land still looked the same from the porch, Harold felt its meaning change every time he gazed out over it. It was no longer just his to plow and seed. It was a story now, one carried in its soil and soon to be shared with all who came to walk upon it. The state moved quickly. Teams of preservationists and architects arrived, their trucks bringing equipment that cut sharp lines into the soft winter ground. They measured, photographed, sketched, and marked areas with flags that fluttered in the wind. Harold watched them from a distance, hands buried in his coat pockets, feeling both the strangeness and inevitability of it all. What once had been furrows he labored over with his tractor were now grids on surveyors' maps. Men and women in hard hats bent to examine the soil where he had once planted rows of corn. He thought he might feel anger at the intrusion, but instead he felt something gentler, almost reverent. They were not taking his land away. They were uncovering what it had always held, giving it a new voice. The first groups of students came in spring. The ground was still being prepared for construction, but word had spread, and schools brought busloads of children who filed across the fields with wide eyes. Harold found himself drawn into their orbit. At first, he lingered at the edges, but teachers began to ask him to speak, to tell the story of what he had found. He resisted, feeling awkward under their expectant gazes, but when he finally began to speak, the words came more easily than he imagined. He told them of the day the tractor stopped, of the chain glinting in the soil, of the chest that emerged from the earth. He described the papers, the lists of names, the cuffs that still carried the weight of human suffering. The children listened with quiet attention, and Harold saw in their faces the kind of connection that gave the land its true power. With each retelling, Harold grew more comfortable. He discovered that his voice, once reserved for murmured thoughts and rare conversations, could hold weight when tied to truth. Reporters came again, not with the same urgency as before, but with a steadier respect, eager to document the transformation of the farm. They asked him what it felt like to give up his life as a farmer, and he answered with honesty. He told them it was painful, that he still woke some mornings expecting to climb onto the tractor or check the soil with his hands, but he also told them that it felt necessary. The farm had chosen a new purpose, and he had chosen to follow. Construction of the memorial began in earnest by summer. The outlines of a visitor center took shape near the old road, and pathways were laid across the fields to guide visitors to the site of the discovery. Interpretive signs were designed, carrying words that spoke of the past with clarity and reverence. Harold was consulted often, his perspective valued not only as the man who had found the chest but as the one whose family had worked the land for generations. At first, he hesitated, unsure what wisdom he could offer, but gradually he came to see that his memories, his quiet devotion to the soil, were themselves a kind of testimony. The hostility that had once clouded the town softened with time. Some neighbors still muttered, unwilling to see their community tied to a history they preferred to forget, but others began to change. They attended meetings, offered help, even brought their own children to the early tours. Harold saw the shift slowly, like the turning of a season, and he realized that the land was doing its work. It was teaching, healing, forcing remembrance where silence had reigned for too long. On quiet evenings, when the construction crews had gone and the fields were still, Harold would walk the paths alone. He would stop at the place where he had first struck the chain with his spade and stand there, listening. He imagined the footsteps of those who had once crossed this ground, the whispers of fear and hope that must have filled the night air. He thought of the letter he had read with its urgent lines about hiding and running north, and he felt humbled to stand where such lives had passed. He no longer saw himself as the sole heir to his father's legacy. He saw himself as part of something larger, a guardian of memory that belonged to many. The opening of the memorial came on a bright autumn day, nearly a year after the discovery. Crowds gathered, filling the fields with voices and movement. But this time, Harold did not shrink from the attention. He stood near the front, watching as officials spoke, as choirs sang, as the ribbon was cut and people stepped onto the paths for the first time. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled notes, children held their parents' hands. The air was filled with both celebration and solemnity. Harold felt the weight of it all, the sorrow and the pride interwoven, and when he was asked to speak, he did so with a steady voice. He told them not just of the day he found the chest, but of the years he had spent struggling to keep the farm alive, and of how the land itself had reminded him that it carried more than crops. It carried memory, and that memory demanded to be honored. When the ceremony ended and the visitors began to wander through the memorial, Harold stepped back. He walked a little way into the fields, away from the noise, until he reached a familiar spot where the soil still bore traces of his last harvest. He stood there, the cool breeze tugging at his jacket, and looked out over the land that had shaped him. It was no longer his in the way it once had been, but it was not lost to him either. It had become something greater, and in giving it up, he had found a new way to belong to it. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields, and Harold felt a deep calm settle over him. For so many years he had feared the loss of the farm, had fought to keep it even as it slipped away. Now he understood that letting go had not been an ending, but a beginning. His legacy was not only in the rows he had planted or the barns he had repaired, but in the truth he had uncovered, the story he had helped bring into the light. He was no longer only a farmer. He was a witness, a keeper of memory, a man whose land had spoken and who had listened. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead, Harold turned back toward the house. The lights of the memorial glowed softly in the distance, and he felt no resentment, no sorrow. He felt pride, quiet and steady, as enduring as the soil beneath his feet. The farm had given him its final gift, and in return he had given it a new life. For the first time in years, Harold walked home with his shoulders unburdened, the weight of legacy transformed into something he could carry not as a burden, but as an honor. Don't let this story end here. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable discovery, and tap the bell so you're the first to see what's coming. Check out the other jaw-dropping stories waiting for you on our channel right now. Trust me, you don't want to miss them. And if this video shocked you, share it with your friends and family so they can be part of the conversation too.